All right. I hope this is recording. Um, cool. So welcome to the Introduction to React and Hooks workshop. And welcome to Hack the North. But hopefully by the end of this, if you haven't already, we'll learn how to build your first React app. All right, so before we jump in, a little bit about myself. Hi, my name is Leslie. It's great to meet everyone. And I'm currently a third year or 3A systems design engineering student here at the University of Waterloo. And I guess outside of school and outside of work, I enjoy painting and I also enjoy collecting plants. So feel free to ask me questions about those things as well. And also I included some of my socials, so feel free to connect. I'm always down to chat afterwards. But before I go into the next slide, I wanted to say a couple words about my background and also why I decided to do a workshop today. So I'm part of the co-op program at the University of Waterloo. So I've been super lucky to get to do 6 internships throughout my undergrad. And so far I've completed 5 of them. And I've done my most recent ones in front-end engineering, which is why I'm doing a workshop in React today, but it didn't always start like that. So I used to be a backend developer actually. And you know, coming from high school, taking courses in Python and Java and C++, and also in university, taking some of the data structures courses, it felt like a super natural transition for myself. And I feel like a lot of people as well. And, you know, back then I was just super scared of front end. I had no idea what it entailed. I didn't know, I wasn't familiar with any of the tools. And to be honest, it just scared me. And back then I also, like I'll be the first to admit, I had some pretty stupid misconceptions about front end, many of which I still see today, you know, online in the software community. But I wanted to share, you know, 2 years later after doing a bunch of front end internships and, you know, kind of falling in love with it, I've learned that those misconceptions are totally untrue. And I've also found that I've discovered that front end is, you know, superhuman. Outside of at work, you know, how we work closely with users, it's also, I find, extremely human to be inspired and engage through our senses. And I think there's just something truly magical to be able to create something that we can see and use and touch out of nothing. So hopefully that will be one of the lessons that you take away from today. All right, so next is the agenda. It's going to be broken down into 4 parts. We're going to start with a short introduction, talk about the building blocks of a website, and hopefully some of it will be review. Next, we're going to talk about what is React, and we are together going to create the most basic React app. Afterwards, we're going to take a quick break in the middle, and then we're going to jump into create React app, what that is, and the easiest way to get started with React, especially at a hackathon. And then lastly, we're going to talk about React hooks and how to refactor your code to use them, and then some other stuff as well. All right, so before we get into the coding, what you're going to need for this workshop, if you'd like to follow along, are firstly, you're going to need an IDE. I'm going to be using VS Code today, and it's what I recommend. But if you're comfortable with something else, like, you know, Atom, Sublime, anything from the IntelliJ suite, go ahead, just use whatever you're comfortable with. Next, you're going to need Node on your machine. So there's the website link right there that you can download it, or if you have a Mac, you can install it using Homebrew if you have that. Just install whatever the most recent version is. And lastly, the link to resources are going to be super helpful. So hopefully you have access to the hack pack and the syllabus. And then also I've created a GitHub repo for today's workshop, which will be super helpful. And it's at this link, but I'm just going to show you really quickly what it looks like. So if you go to the repository and go to the commits, I've broken it down into each section. So we have basic React, create React app, and then hooks. And then each of those sections have different parts as well that I'll be referring to. So you can easily navigate to the code from here through the GitHub UI. All right, so jumping into it, what makes a website? So I put together this quick illustration inspired by something I found online. But yeah, it's the building blocks of a website. So, you know, on the left, we have HTML, which is the structure of our website. It's what defines the sections that our website has, the types of sections those are, and also what order they're in. Next, we have CSS, which is the style of your website. It's what enables our websites to not look like trash and also what lets them look unique. And lastly, we have JavaScript. So this enables us to add more complex logic and more interactivity to our websites. And a quick fact about JavaScript in general is that it actually has nothing to do with Java. I definitely thought that before I learned it. It was actually named JavaScript to ride on the popularity of Java. So that was pretty cool. All right, so that was kind of an introduction. Now jumping into what is React. All right, what is React? Okay, so taken straight from the React docs, React is an open source front-end JavaScript library for building user interfaces or UI components. If you haven't used libraries or frameworks before, no worries. It's just a fancy way of saying a structure that defines the way apps are written. And frameworks and libraries do this by setting a very clear set of rules about how data can flow through your app and also how the UI will adapt as a result of that changing data and a result of your changing code. And also React was, I think, released in 2013, and it's created and maintained by Facebook. All right, next, so now that we know a little bit about what React is, why React? So there's a bunch of reasons to use React, but two of the main reasons that I believe are important to React, and I think a lot of other people agree with as well, are components and the virtual DOM. So firstly, with components, components allow us to break down complex UIs and complex websites into modular parts. First of all, these components are encapsulated. So each component worries about itself and its own state and its own data. And next, if not most importantly, components are reusable. So you define it one time, but you can use it as many times as you'd like. An analogy, that I'd really enjoy is the rubber stamp analogy, which is just like you define a component, you can create or you can buy like a rubber stamp, and you just have to buy it or build it one time, but you can use it as many times as you'd like. And next, the virtual DOM. So the React DOM library creates a virtual representation of the real DOM. So the real DOM is if you navigate to a website and right-click and inspect and you see the elements, that's kind of a representation of the DOM, but it's super expensive and slow to keep on updating this HTML. So the idea of a virtual DOM was created, and it helps React.js to know exactly when to re-render and when to not re-render, because it can detect the flow of data through the app and know when it's changed. And this is what makes React super fast. All right, so now we're going to break down Uber Eats. So the reason why we're doing this is because today, at the end of this workshop, hopefully we'll create our own restaurant or our own kind of menu app. But we're going to start here. So this is how we usually start building any React application. We take a design or some wireframe, and we section it off like this into what we think would be logical components. So if we took Uber Eats here, you see we have a title bar, we have a navigation bar with different pages, and we have these cards or these dishes. And as you can see, we have this dish card repeated 3 times. And that's a clear indicator that it's a component because it's the same thing with a little bit different data, but the same structure. All right, so this is a little bit too complicated to build in a 1-hour workshop, but today we're going to build something more simple, something that looks a little bit like this. So we're not going to have the title and the nav components, but we're going to have a general app component, which is going to serve as our body. And then we'll have dish components as well, which will serve as the dishes. So we're going to have those 2 components that we're going to build today. And what you see on the right side is the component tree. So this is after you've boxed out your components, this is what you would do next. And this kind of defines the flow of data and which parent components are going to have which children. So because here we only have 2 different kinds of components, we have the app component and its children will be the dish components. And here on the left side, you can see underneath the dish, I put name and count. I kind of boiled down this app to the two most important pieces of data we need. So a dish needs to have a unique name, and it also needs to have a count if you're going to order through it. So basically the number of that dish you'd like to order. And here you can see that these, the name and the count are 2 pieces of data that belong kind of to the dish. But here they're represented a little bit differently. And I'm going to talk about the difference between state and props. So first of all, props are kind of like the parameters or the arguments that you receive in a function. The same way, a parent component passes props, passes data down to its child this way in an object. And you can see here, the only props value we have is name. But for within the dish, we have state, which is similar to props, as in it's data that belongs to the component, but it's not in terms of the fact that it is local to each instance of a component. So this dish 1 will have its own state, its own count, and the second dish will also have that, and the third dish as well. And the main difference between the two is that props is immutable, so that means it cannot be changed, versus state changes over the lifetime of each instance of a component. So therefore it's immutable. All right, so now we are going to dive into the live coding part. So this first part, we're going to build the world's simplest React app. And this part is kind of optional if you'd like to follow along. So don't worry if I'm going a little bit quickly or if you're a little bit confused, because it'll all be in the GitHub. But I think the most important part to kind of follow along will be the create React app part, which will be the next section. All right, so if everyone goes to the desktop or wherever they'd like to create this project, I'm going to have you create a new folder and call it whatever you'd like, but I'm just going to call it rename. Oh gosh, I'm going to call it rename restaurant. Let's call it simple because it will be the simple React app. And then you're going to go ahead and open up your ID of choice. And as I mentioned, I'm using VS Code today. And we're just going to open up that folder. So I'm going to go to my desktop, open up restaurant simple. And then once that loads, all right, we're going to create a new file in here. And we're going to call it index.html. All right, hopefully everyone has that. All right, so in here, we're going to start off with the basic HTML scaffold. So that is just like, your typical HTML file, no React yet. VS Code has this really cool extension that you can use. So if you type in HTML:5, you'll see this thing that says emit abbreviation, which is basically, it just helps you set up different scaffolds for things. You can also use it for HTML tags, but it's not unique to VS Code. So if you're using another IDE, you can totally install it. It just comes with VS Code. And if I click enter, you can see we have a typical HTML scaffold. And we're going to start by changing this name to, we're going to call it, Hack the North Restaurant. And we are going to add one div to our body. So let's start off with a simple HTML tag, and we're just going to put hello world, just to have something, on our screen. And I'm just going to add a quick ID here and call it root. All right, so if we save this and we open this, or if you open your browser, let's do that instead. I'm just going to be using Chrome today. And then open that file in your browser. Restaurant simple, index.html. We should see hello world. Perfect. Okay, so now we have, a super simple web page. All right, so now we're going to add React to it. And we have to do that first by importing it. So we're going to add a script tag. And type script. And in here, we're going to add a source. And this is going to be linked in the GitHub, but I'm just going to copy it and paste it in here. But it's this URL to a CDN, which is basically a bucket that stores a bunch of NPM packages for us to access. And this one stores React. And then we're going to add another script tag. And here for the source, we are going to copy in another URL, which will be similar, but a little bit different. So we're going to copy in this URL that is react-dom instead. So in these two areas, just add -dom. All right, and we're going to go ahead and save that. So you might be wondering why there are two different packages we have to import instead of just one. It's because the React package is also shared by React Native, and the React DOM package in particular is used to render React to the browser, which is why it's not needed by React Native. All right, now we're going to refresh this in Chrome, and if we inspect and navigate to our console, and we type in React, we should see that it is defined now, and same with React DOM. All right, cool. So we've imported React. Now, what do we do with it? So as we were talking about before, one of the key components of React are components. So we're going to start off by creating our first component. And if you remember, going back to the slides, we have our app component as the base. So we're going to create that one first. All right, so because we're writing more JavaScript, we're going to add another script tag. And in here, we're going to start by creating a functional component, which is essentially any JavaScript function that returns some markup, which is what defines something as a component. So we're going to start with const app. We're using a arrow function here. And we're going to return from this because, as I mentioned, for something to qualify as a component, it needs to return some markup. We're going to return capital React dot, we're going to call this function create element. So create element, what it does is it essentially just generates markup, and it creates an instance of a component that you pass to it. So it takes in 3 parameters. The first one is either a custom component that you've created or an HTML tag. So in this case, we're going to start off with the title because we're in the app component. So we're just going to start off with an h1 tag. Next, we're going to have empty parentheses, so an empty object. And the second parameter here, it's the children that you are passing to, the data that you're passing to your children. So this is what props would be. And the last parameter, so if you created a component with an HTML tag, it's a string that you want to display on the screen. Otherwise, it's kind of the children of your component. So here, because we're rendering a title, we're going to render Hack the North restaurant. Cool. So, and that's about it. So now we've created our first component, the world's simplest component. So if we save that, refresh here, yeah, nothing's going to happen because if we think back to the analogy before, we've created our stamp, but we haven't actually stamped it. Like we haven't actually used it. And to be able to do that, we need to render. So to be able to render something, instead of using the React library, we use the React DOM library. So we do React DOM, and we call this render function. And this render function takes in 2 parameters. So the first parameter that it takes is the component that you'd like to render to the DOM. And then the second parameter is where in the DOM you'd like to render it. So for the first one, we want to call React.createElement again, but now we want to basically stamp our app component. So create an instance of our app component, the same way you create an instance of a class. And then the second one, we want to render it in our root div. So we just do document.getElement by ID, and then root. And if we save this and refresh, we should see Hack the North restaurant. Cool. All right. So now we have technically the world's simplest React app. But we haven't really leveraged kind of the important things of React, which are the ability to create nested components, for components to be able to have children, and for us to be able to pass data down. So let's do that. So now that we've created a app component, what else do we need to create? So we need to create our dish components. So let's go ahead and do that. If we do const, same syntax as before, dish, arrow function, and same as before, react.create element. And this time let's render an h2 tag, so it's like a subtitle, and we're going to use empty brackets again, and here we're just going to type the word dish for now. All right, if we save this and refresh, nothing's going to show up again because we haven't actually used our component, we've just defined it. But for us to be able to use it, and for us to be able to tell React that this component is a child of app, we need to render it within app and define it in here, the third parameter of create element, as its children. So create element takes a string, but it also takes a list with square brackets. So we're going to render its children in here. And all the syntax is just react.create element again. And instead of doing an HTML tag like h1 or h2, we're going to type dish, which references our component. Comma, empty object again. And then we are going to, we don't need actually a third parameter, just because we don't really want to render any text because that's happening in our dish component. So if we save this, sorry, this must be a semicolon, we will be able to see the dish component. So that means we're successfully rendering our dish component. But what we did lose was the title. So let's bring it back in here. Let us add react.create element and bring back our h1. Back to north restaurant, and then add a comma. And in here, one thing I forgot was instead of an h1, now because a component has children, we want to use something like a div to be able to wrap it all in one parent tag. If we refresh that, there we go. We should see a title now with our one component rendered as a child of it underneath it. But this isn't too powerful because I could just kind of hard code that. The power comes when we want to use a component multiple times. So what if we copy and paste this dish component, like 3 times, because let's just copy what we have here. If we save that and refresh this, we will see the dish component 3 times without doing any more work, which is what makes React super special. All right, so now that we've done this, the last thing we need to do is make each of these components unique, because if they were exactly the same, they wouldn't be too useful. So what we want to make different is the name. We want to make add a unique name to each of these dishes. So how we do that is, if you think back, is through props. All right, so as we were saying before, the second parameter of create element is an empty parentheses, or also the props. And right now it's empty, but let's add something to it. So in here, it takes an object, and if we go back here, it takes, we want to add a name variable. So let's add name, and I don't know, let's do pizza as our first dish. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and copy and paste this and save it. But nothing is going to happen here because we're not referencing it in our child. We have to, because it's passed down like a parameter or an argument in a function, we need to be able to use it somehow. So do that by saying props, just like an argument of a function. But here, instead of dish, we're going to render the name of it. So we're going to do props, and because it's an object, we're going to do dot name and save that. And then if we refresh over here, we should see that if we make these unique, we should see that we should have 3 unique children and 3 unique components, which is kind of cool, right? Yeah, and oh, one thing I wanted to mention was if we refresh here, you can see for a split second that it says hello world. And that's because we still have hello world here rendered in the div. And that's because just a split second before React kind of injects these components into the DOM, it still renders what's behind it. So it's kind of a useful way to let you know if your React is functioning properly, if you can see kind of what's rendered underneath. All right, so let us go back to the presentation. All right, so this would be some time to take a quick break. Because this is a recording, we're just going to jump straight into the next section. So I don't know, feel free to pause here. But yeah, let's go into Create React App. So Create React App. Again, this is taken straight from the docs, but Create React App is a comfortable environment for learning React and is the best way to start building a new single-page application in React. So Create React App is one of many of React's tool chains. So what that really means is just bundle together a bunch of React tools to make developers' lives easier. And Create React App, outside of being the most popular because it's super beginner friendly, it basically contains everything you would need to start a new React project. It has other useful things like testing and analytics and stuff like that. All right, so let us jump into the Create React App part of this, which is the part, if you'd like to follow along, is the part that I'd recommend you do so. All right, so we're going to close this for now. We're going to close this as well. So here we're going to open up our terminal. And again, navigate to wherever you'd like to store this project. Again, I'm just going to put this on my desktop. And we are going to type in this line of code. So everyone should have npm already or Node installed on your computer, and you can check that by just typing like npm. And you should see just basically these commands to tell you that it's there. If not, you can navigate back to, I think it should be in the syllabus or Hackpack, the link to download Node onto your machine. But you can check if you have it, and if you do, let's go ahead and type in npx, that's not a typo, npx create-react-app, and then the name of our app. So today we're just going to call it Hack the North Restaurant, but you can call it anything you'd like. And before I click enter, so npx, it's npx because of npm, is because it is essentially the same thing, but there's just some additional like command line tools that come with it. And they make it easy to install dependencies and etc. But also here, if I click enter, it's going to start basically installing Create React App and downloading it, but it's going to start doing it with Yarn, which is the default package manager. In my mind, I don't have too much of a preference. I usually use Yarn, but if you're for some reason really love npm, you could add on to the end of this --use-npm, and it will start using npm instead. But it's probably Yarn because it's Facebook. But I don't have too much of a preference, so I'm going to go ahead and click enter. And it will start creating our new React app for us. All right, so this is going to take a little bit, just a couple minutes. But in the meantime, this is a good place for us to stop for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat, and hopefully someone can answer it for you, one of the workshop helpers. And if you don't have any questions, this is also a good time to take a look at the GitHub repository and kind of look over what we've done. And also, if you don't have kind of like Node installed or your IDE installed, this is a good time to do that as well. I hope I didn't offend anyone by saying there's not that much of a difference between yarn and npm. I feel like people in the comments are going to be upset, but don't hate me. All right, I think it's almost done. But yeah, if you look in here and at all the dependencies, it installs things like, Jest for testing. Oh, there we go. We're done. Cool. So once it's completed, you should see, all of these yarn commands, or if you used npm, your npm commands, and it should say happy hacking. All right, so let us first navigate into our app. And then we are going to open up our IDE. Okay, cool. Once you have your IDE open in your terminal, I'm going to go ahead and start a new terminal from here, so we can open the app on the right side. But in your terminal, you're going to type yarn start, which is going to start up the server for us. In your browser at port 3000. And once that loads, I'm going to start talking about basically some of the components of Create React App. So it does come with a lot of files, but they are mostly important. So I guess the first thing are the node modules. So this contains any external like libraries or dependencies that you install, and it's super simple to manage them this way. And as you can see, there's quite a lot already. Source is going to be pretty much what we care about. It's going to be where we're going to be writing most of our code. And it comes with also helpful things like README and whatnot. But cool. Okay, so we see that our React app has started, and this is what the default code is. It's just the spinning React logo. But let's start with getting rid of what we don't need. So actually, before that, let's talk about kind of how this is being rendered at the moment. So we're going to start in the index.js file, very similar to like the index.html file we were seeing before, but a little bit different. So here, hopefully this is a little bit familiar, but this is the same thing that we were doing before. So the React DOM.render, and it's rendering in the root and also rendering our app component. The only thing that's different this time is it's being wrapped by strict mode, which is essentially just, it's like a tool that React has for highlighting problems in your code. But if we ignore that, we have app. The one difference that I wanted to point out here was before in here, we called react.createElement, which was JavaScript. But here we're straight up using what looks like an HTML tag, but not really. This is called JSX, which stands for, I think, JavaScript XML, which is basically a way for us to inject our JavaScript into our HTML. And React has tools in the background to be able to transpile that to JavaScript. So basically this gets translated to what we had before, the react.createElement. All right, but if we dive into app.js, you'll see this is also kind of similar. We have a functional component, but let's take out all of the guts that we don't need. All right, remove this class name app. We don't need all of these imports. So we just have like a super bare bones function being exported. And here we're going to do the same thing as before. Start off with rendering hello world. Save that, and it should hot reload. So that means it just like changes. You don't need to refresh your browser. And once this is done compiling, we should be able to see our changes on the right. Oh, it's still compiling. All right, cool. We see hello world. Great. So this is kind of the equivalent to what we created at the beginning. But let's go ahead and create the dish component that we had before. And before we create that component, I just wanted to mention that if you navigate to the GitHub repository and you go to the index.css file in GitHub, I wrote some CSS for this workshop today just so what we created wouldn't be so ugly. But of course, this is not a CSS, workshop. Like, I'm not trying to make any commentary from the CSS. It's just to make it look not bad. But if you copy and paste that, like I'm going to do right now, and paste it in, yeah, it should style some of the things we have today. So yeah, there we go. But cool, let's go ahead and create our dish component. So this time, instead of putting everything in one page, which you totally can do, we're going to opt for creating a new file, which is kind of the convention. We're going to call it dish.js. And we're going to go ahead and create a we're going to go ahead and create a class component. So if we go back to what we did before, or go back to this diagram, last time we had props, which is passing down data to each component, but we didn't have the state. We didn't have the count. And that is because you cannot have, without hooks, you cannot have state in class components. This is a really important concept to understand. You may only have state in class components, no state in functional components without hooks. So that is why, for the first example, before we refactor it, we're going to create a class component for dish. So we're going to do that by importing React from React. And this time we're going to export, not export function, we're going to export class, call it dish, the same name as our file. And it extends react.component. So it just inherits from this class. In here, the core things that we need to make a component are, it needs to return some markup, right? So we need to call this render function. And within render, which is basically just defining what we want to render to the page, we want to return some JSX this time. So the only difference now, instead of returning react.createElement, we're going to return what looks like HTML tags, but aren't really. And in here, we're going to, again, have our div, and we're going to render dish. And here, we're just going to add class name dish, which will just call one of our CSS classes, just to make it look a little bit nicer. All right, if we save that, the last thing we need to add to make this kind of a functioning component is the constructor. So similar to any class that you write in any language. So here we have constructor. And in here, there are a couple things that we want to do. So the first one is we want to call this function called super. So what super does is super calls the constructor of its parent class. So whatever would be rendering this, in this case, the app component. And it's essentially required if you need to access any variables from a parent. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to add in props and pass that to super. And what this does is enables, the only difference by passing props to super is it enables us to use this keyword inside the constructor. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. And you need this word in the constructor to be able to create state for that component, or initialize state. Sorry. So we do that by doing this dot state equals an object and whatever state variable we want. And in that case, we want counter. Counter, and then you can initialize it to something, because the constructor will just be called when the instance of each component is created. So we want to start off with 0. All right, and this keyword, all it does is just references the instance of the component that basically called the function. Cool, so if we save this, nothing should happen, just because, again, we've defined the component, but we haven't actually used it. We haven't stamped it. So we're going to do that by coming in here to our app component, and we're going to import dish from dish. And the reason why we have these curly braces here is because it is a not a default export. So if we came here, like if we didn't export it there and we did export default, you know, similar to what we have here, we wouldn't need these curly brackets. All right, so now we have that. We want to come in here and instead of rendering hello world, let us render. So let's first render our restaurant title. So let's just do an H1. Again, call it Hack the North Restaurant. And here we're going to render our dish components. So here, I guess we don't need any, we don't need to pass a string to it, but we do need to pass props to it. And this is how you do it. So very similar to HTML properties. So here we have like the HTML H1 tag, and you would pass an ID to it this way, right? Similarly, we would pass props to our dish component. So instead, we created our own props variable, which is, actually we haven't used it yet, so we can define it for the first time here. But let's call it name, because I think that makes sense for the name. And this will just be the name of our dish. So again, let's just do, you know, pizza. And we can copy and paste this and render it a couple times. Pizza, pasta, soup, I think we had. If we save that and save this and refresh it, all right, cool. So now we have a title. We have our three components, which look like cards, but they all say dish. And you probably well, you might be wondering, why does it say dish and why does it not say what the string that we passed down to it? And that's because we've, you know, brought props into this component. It's technically accessible, but we're not actually using it anywhere. Here in the JSX, we're just rendering dish. So to be able to use the prop variables, we do it like this. We have to use curly braces, and that's what tells React that we're going to inject JavaScript into the HTML or the JSX. And we just do props. So we access that object, or sorry, this dot props, and access that object, and then the name of the prop variable. So if we save that and run that, all right, now we see the unique names of our components, which is pretty cool. All right, so what else do we need to add? We need to add the amount, like the counter. So the first thing that we're going to do is, because we're adding now, you know, more than one tag, we want to create one parent tag around everything. So instead, we're going to wrap, you know, the name, we're going to wrap it around an H2. And we are going to render underneath it a amount. And it's going to be, oh, sorry, some amount. And to be able to access it again is using our curly braces, this, and instead of props this time, we want to access count, but we're not getting this value from a parent. It's local to our component, and it's initialized within our component. It's initialized in our state object, which is why we're going to use this dot state, and then dot the state variable name, which is counter. And then we're going to save that. And when we refresh, we should be able to see not only the name of our dishes, but also the amount. And it all starts at 0 because it's initialized with 0. So what do we need to add now? Now we need to add some interactivity. So something to be able to manipulate the state, because there's no point in having state if it's not going to change. You might as well just hard code that data, right? So we need something, we need the user to be able to interact with this web page, and then we need the button or whatever we create to be able to trigger something to change the state. So let's do that. So let's add in a button, just an HTML button. And let's say the button says add dish. And we're going to add something that happens after a button is clicked. So we're going to use the property, HTML property on click. And this expects a function. So a function needs to run after this. So let's go up here in our component and define a function. So let's call the function add dish, because that's what it's doing. Again, we're going to define a arrow function, and it's going to increment the state of the counter. So we use this dot state to initialize state, but if you ever want to change it in the future, you have to use a function that's this dot set state. And it expects a object, the new state object. So instead, we're going to pass in counter, and we're going to grab the data, like grab the old value of the counter in the state and then increment that by 1. So we're going to do this dot state dot counter, much like we did down here to render it onto the page, and we're going to do +1. All right, so that is changing our state. And now all we do is we take this function and pass it into onClick. All right, and if we save this and it reloads over here, all right, we should see our buttons, which is super cool. So if we click them now, we should see that the amount increments, because what's happening is it's triggering this function, which triggers the state. And every time the state changes, it triggers a refresh, because the DOM gets updated. The virtual DOM gets updated because it knows data has changed. And as you can see, all of this is, all of these values are unique to each instance of a component. So these are independent of each other. All right, and one thing that's pretty cool that I discovered recently is that you can add emojis to your code. So I'm going to do that to make it a little bit more interesting. But you can add like pizza, you can add pasta, and you can add soup, which I thought was pretty cool. And let's see. All right, there we go. Cool. Okay, all right, let's go back to our slides now. So now that we've learned about Create React App, let's talk about what are React hooks. And I've been kind of mentioning them throughout this presentation, but let's discover what they truly are, and then let's refactor our code to make it better and to use them. So again, I think from the docs, React hooks enable us to use state inside functional components and to simplify code to make it easier to read. So let's go ahead and do that. So I think the really key point here is that before you had to use class components, like you had to define something like this with a constructor and using the this keyword to be able to use state at all, which it's not bad, but it is kind of clunky. I feel like if I was looking at this for the first time, not understanding React, I'd be like, what is happening here? Like, what is state and what is going on? React hooks let you add state to a functional component just by easily calling a function. So let's kind of show how you would go about refactoring an old app to use hooks. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to redefine this. So instead of export class, dish extends React component, we're going to export constant because we're going to use an arrow function syntax, constant dish. is a component like this now. We're going to get rid of constructor because it's not a class. It doesn't need a constructor anymore. We're going to get rid of this function for the time being. We're just going to put it back later. And the other difference is that it doesn't need a render function anymore. It could just return, much like what we did before. So if you look at this, and it's pretty bare bones, and I'm also just going to remove all of the guts of this. So all of the, accessing state and accessing props. Same with this. I'm just going to pass in an empty function so it doesn't fail on us. But this should look kind of familiar to the world's simplest React app we were doing before. All right, as you can see, it's not really rendering anything. But yeah, as you can see, like it took away a bunch of lines of code. Actually, we don't even need this line of code. We don't even need the import React. And it makes it much simpler to read and understand as someone who just understands JavaScript. All right, so the way we use a state is, actually, let's take this line back because we need to import use state from React. But there's a function called use state. And the reason why it's called this way is because this is the convention for hooks. All hooks start with the prefix use. And technically you can make a hook that's not called that, but the React creators and maintainers highly recommend it just because React kind of checks for the use keyword and make sure that you're using hooks in the right way. All right, so we've imported use state and this is how we use it. So we're gonna start with const and an array. And for the first element of the array, we're gonna write our state variable. And the second one is the function to be able to change the state variable. So it's set, very much like set state, but in this time it's referencing the individual state variable, so set counter. And that's the cool thing about hooks as well. It lets us think about state individual to each state variable instead of as an object. So it's a lot more flexible and easy to use. And that equals, so we're going to call the use state hook. So use state returns an array with the first index being the variable and the second index being a function. And what I'm doing here is just array destructuring JavaScript syntax to be able to just get the variables immediately. And what use state accepts as an argument is the initial value of the counter or whatever your variable is. And much like before, we're going to initialize it at 0. All right, so if we save that, now we have state. Much more easier, cleaner, less lines of code, and in my opinion, just easier to understand. All right, so now let's add it back into our application. So to be able to, kind of access the amount, so before we did this .state.counter, now we can just call the counter variable and we can use it straight away. And let's add back our function for the onClick. So let's add back add dish. And in here, instead of doing this .set state and passing in an object, all we need to do is call the set counter function and pass in the new value of it, which is the old value of counter plus 1. It's as simple as that. And then all we do is we pass it to onClick, just like before. If we save that, we will see that the amount and the add dish is working, but we're still missing one other thing, which is right here, which is our props. So yeah, you can see that this works now, but we're missing the props. And props, kind of like before, it's just how you pass in arguments into a function. So we're just going to say props up here, and we're going to access that exactly the way we did in our super simple React app, which is props, the object, and then the name of the variable, which is name. And we don't need to change anything with the parent, which makes, which in my opinion, makes hooks like super easy to implement into an existing code base, because it's not like you need to recode everything from scratch or kind of change the entire code base at once. You can simply, start from one component and work your way from there. So it's really nice and easy that way. All right, if we save it and we look on the right side, yeah, we have the exact same app that we had before, but if you look at this code, it's much simpler, much cleaner, much more understandable, and shorter. Very cool. So I think the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add one more prop just to kind of show how that works one more time. So, and just to show that like props, it's an object. So here we have name, but let's add in something else that I think is important to restaurants and menus. Let's add in the price. So for a price, for integers or numbers, you have to use curly braces. So let's make, I don't know, pizza $10. Let's make pasta $15. And let's make soup, I don't know, $7. And if we save that, nothing's going to happen here just because we're not using that prop value yet. So if we go here and I think just add another line and put price, let's put a $sign in front of it. And instead we're going to do props dot price and save that. All right, now we can see the price and you can see how it's unique to each component, but the thing is that it cannot be changed. So props are immutable and state is mutable, as you can see here. This data is props, this data is state. All right, very cool. All right, so to finish off today's workshop, I created this like quick overview of everything. It's kind of an information dense slide, but let's start here. So again, React's core features. So outside of React's popularity, its maintainers, etc. React's core features and what makes it super attractive to a lot of people are its reusable components, which break things down into modular parts and in a super logical way. So that, and also the ability of the virtual DOM, which makes it super fast. If we move over here, there's a difference between class components and functional components. So class components, without hooks, it has state, but it's longer and more complex. On the other hand, we have functional components. So without hooks, there's no state. It's more concise and more modular code. All right, if we go down here to state and props, so the difference is state is data within a specific instance of a component that changes over time. And it's mutable. That means it changes, again, like throughout the lifetime of this component. Props, on the other hand, is data or the inputs passed down from the parent component. Props are immutable because once you pass it down, you cannot change the props within that child. All right, lastly, we have the no hooks and hooks comparison. So for no hooks, you must use class components to use state. And also, stateful logic can only be used in the component it's defined in. This is something we didn't really cover, but it's, I think, important to cover. So with hooks, because there are functions, you can technically write your own hooks. And that way, you can extract stateful logic outside of a component, which is super cool if you have a couple similar components that use similar stateful logic. And with hooks, you can now use state and functional components, and stateful logic can be shared amongst components. All right, so this is a good, I think, good slide to kind of screenshot and save if you're a React beginner, and something that you could continue to reference. All right, so we've come to the end of the workshop. Before we finish and move on to questions, I want to say thank you. Thank you for spending an hour with me and participating in this workshop. I really, really appreciate it, and I hope you were able to take something from it. And as kind of like my last words, I just want to say, try not to take things, too seriously. I know we just did a super technical workshop and talked about React and tools and did some live coding, but like try not to get caught up in all of these details and make sure to remember, how cool the stuff we're doing actually is. Like we are sitting here, as students, most of us, and we are essentially building something that a lot of people use. Millions of people use, out of nothing, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. And yeah, just always remember that we have the ability to build whatever we can imagine. And yeah, So I'd like to wish you happy hacking. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat or post them on Discord, where I can hopefully answer them for you. But again, feel free to connect with me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, anything, and we can chat more over there. But thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Hack the North.